to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today's text of 2 Samuel chapter 4 really brings us a similar event to what we've seen in the previous chapters. Almost the third time we've seen the same thing happen. When Ish-Bosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Now Saul's son had two men who were captains of raiding bands. The name of the one was Baanah, and the name of the other was Rechab, sons of Rimmon, of a man of Benjamin from Beeroth. For Beeroth also is counted part of Benjamin. The Beerothites fled to Gittaim, and have been sojourners there to this day. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, set out, and about the heat of the day they came to the house of Ish-Bosheth as he was taking his noonday rest. And they came into the midst of the house as if to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and Baanah his brother escaped. When they came into the house as he lay on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and put him to death and beheaded him. They took his head and went by the way of the Arabah all night, and brought the head of Ish-Bosheth to David at Hebron. And they said to the king, "Here is the head of Ish-Bosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Yahweh has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring." But David answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As Yahweh lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, 'Behold, Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth?" And David commanded his young men, and they killed them, and cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ish-Bosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. This is the word of the Lord. A bit of a shorter chapter today, and some interesting conversation, which is primarily, I think what would probably be the most interesting, is what seems like very odd and random placement of verse 4. Let's come back to that. So we started the text with going back to Ish-Bosheth. So we've only seen Ish-Bosheth in this book, son of Saul, the king of Israel, and he has been set up by Abner, his commander, as the king of Israel, rejecting David's role, and instead trying to continue on the line of Saul. Saul's death occurred in the end of 1 Samuel in chapter 31, and now we have the death of Ish-Bosheth, his son, here. His other sons had already died in chapter 31 with him. And so this would be the end of the line of King Saul, were it not for verse 4. So that's part of why verse 4 is there. But we'll get to more of that in a little bit as well. So having heard that his commander was dead, having heard Abner had died, Ish-Bosheth lost all courage. He lost essentially his will to fight, his will to be a king, and to try to challenge David any longer. This is all gone from him. And it's interesting that this happens now, because Abner had already abdicated his position. Abner had already rejected Ish-Bosheth and turned sides and joined David and made a covenant with David before being betrayed and killed by Joab. We get a couple of brothers, Baanah and Rechab, at the end of verse 2 there. They're part of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is the tribe, the 12 descendants of Israel, that gets the land where Jerusalem is. So all that land of Jerusalem and surrounding Jerusalem, if you think of Israel being divided into 12 parts, so smaller territories, Jerusalem and its surrounding cities and villages belonged to Benjamin. And so that gives you a helpful location, even if we don't know necessarily where something like Gataim may be. It was part of Benjamin. So they're not far from Jerusalem as they move from one city to another. In this text, they were sojourners, they were foreigners, they were outsiders. They were staying in a place that was not their own home. All right, so now that we're here, let's talk about verse 4, this odd placement. So you do have the idea that the line of Saul has not been erased. We're about to read of Ish-Bosheth being assassinated in the paragraph to come. So it is not over. And with that, you have a couple of promises. And this is a particular note to verse 8. Yahweh has avenged my Lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring. See if your children can recall what promises. I know it's been maybe a couple months since we were in 1 Samuel. But what promises had David made, especially to Jonathan? But there was also a conversation that happened with King Saul when Saul had tried to kill him again. Common occurrence there. The promise here is that David had said that he would provide for Jonathan's house especially, but Saul had made the same request for his own family tree, essentially that when David took over the throne that he would still care for Saul's family and not destroy them from Israel. So that's part of this placement with verse 4. We learn of Jonathan's son, so a grandson of Saul, a nephew to Ish-Bosheth. And as they were fleeing that day when they lost the battle, he fell, somehow endured some kind of a permanent injury that made him incapable of walking. And they named him Mephibosheth. Now, I want to break down the names. You should have noticed the similarity between the uncle and his nephew and their names. Ish-Bosheth, Mephibosheth. Bosheth is the Hebrew word for shame. Ish, or Ish, is the Hebrew word for man. So Ish-Bosheth is man of shame. Not a good name. Mephibosheth means one who destroys shame. So that's a really interesting naming connection, and part of why I think this verse does end up here with verse 4 is the idea that Mephibosheth will be cared for by David, whereas Ish-Bosheth had carried on shame by rejecting the Lord's anointing of David as king over Israel. So here's the one that favors, here's the one that doesn't. David will care for the one and not for the other. That's the kind of picture I think is being set up. So we have the continuation of Saul's family does happen, and also this contrast between Ish-Bosheth and Mephibosheth. Now, with their names being there next to each other, it also sets up the possibility that those aren't their first names, that these are the names that they came to be called over time, or maybe even just one of them, like Ish-Bosheth. Maybe we struggled with his name not being in the list of Saul's sons before. Maybe that's the reason why. Maybe this is something that he's being called now, in hindsight, as a dishonorable thing because he had dishonored the Lord. I don't know. Scriptures don't give us these things. Not in this situation. They sometimes do in other spots, but it's certainly a curiosity, at least with the text here and the way that these are set up. All right. From Mephibosheth's name, there's a question you can ask your children. As his name means one who destroys shame. Really, we're closer to Ish-Bosheth. We are men of shame as sinners. And so the question for our kids is, who is our Mephibosheth? Who is the one who destroys our shame? And the answer to that is Jesus, who takes our shame away from us on the cross. That actually goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, Verse 25, we learn that after Adam and Eve had been created and joined as husband and wife, they were both naked and they felt no shame. But immediately after the fall into sin in chapter 3, shame plagued creation. So actually this conversation about shame, and if your children are older, body image can come into that conversation as well. And then Jesus restoring us into the image of God himself. That can be a wonderful conversation to have together with older kids. All right, as we get into the last paragraph of the text today, the assassination of Ish-Bosheth by his own men. They killed him, and they brought David his head. Similar event to what we saw back in the first chapter, to the Amalekite who brought David the news of Saul's death and claimed to have killed him. Now here we have another attempt to earn favor with David. The Amalekite thought the news of Saul's death, that he had killed Saul, which he hadn't, that was a lie, would make him favored in David's eyes, would earn him a reward. And David even mentions that here. But instead, the reward he gave him was his death, his execution for that crime of killing the king, the Lord's anointed. Important note. And so here, Rechab and Baanah think that they will get a reward from David. And they do. The same reward as the Amalekite. They get executed for what they've done. David continues to not condone human vengeance, but instead to trust that the Lord will care for what the Lord wants to have happen with his people. The Lord is in control. The Lord has given authority, and I will let the Lord deal with it as he pleases. That has a message to speak to Christians today. All governing authority comes from God. It doesn't matter if you like the way that they're doing it or not. It is not your place as a Christian, as an individual, to rebel against that governing authority. Their authority is from God. If you rebel against their governing authority, you're rebelling against God himself. Now, God can act himself if they have not done well with his authority that he's entrusted to him. They have to answer to him, not to us. And so the Lord can and does act. Sometimes he does it directly. Sometimes he makes use of other governing authorities. As you think of, for example, I tend to go to an example of a world war. The World War II, as you had Germany misusing its power and killing people for no reason, well, no good reason, nations like the United States, England, others, the allied powers that stepped in to fight back, it wasn't individual actions, it was other governing authorities who have the power of the sword acting against a governing authority who also had the power of the sword. God uses nation to judge nation. Assyria judged Israel. Babylon judged Judah. Persia judged Babylon. Greece judged Persia. Rome judged Greece. It just goes on and on. The Lord works in ways that he chooses, not in the ways that we choose. So something of note from this as well. The Lord, he receives some praise here in verse 9 from David. Probably our last note really on this. And that's just simply a note of praise. Yahweh has redeemed David out of his life, out of every adversity in his life. Yahweh saves, Yahweh redeems. It's a good note to end on for us today. And tomorrow we will look at chapter 5 as David is anointed king over all of Israel.